Welcome everyone to the IGP Directors Seminar. My name's Professor Henrietta Moore. I'm the founder and director of the Institute for Global Prosperity. Lovely to have you all with us today. And it's my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Mark Lang. Mark Lang is a socioeconomic and public policy researcher and consultant with a wide range of experience in policy development at local, regional, and national levels. He's an expert in place-based sustainable local economic development and regeneration, and he co-developed the deep place approach to sustainable placemaking. And over the last 6 years, he has applied this in several communities in Wales. He has a PhD in political science from Cardiff University, where he is also Honorary University Associate at the Sustainable Places Research Institute. And the title of his talk this evening is Places of Hope, using the deep place approach for socially, economically, environmentally, and culturally sustainable places. Mark, welcome to the IGP. Thank you so much for coming. We're delighted to have you, and let me offer you the floor, please.
Well, thank you very much. And indeed, thank you for inviting me to join you this afternoon. It's an honor to have been invited, and I've just been looking at some of the other speakers as part of this seminar series and what company to be in. So hopefully I don't disappoint too much. I also note that your next speaker is also from Wales, Jane Davidson, and I know Jane very well, and Jane was instrumental in the development of the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act in Wales, of course, as a former Welsh Government minister. And I'm sure, I don't know what she's talking about, but I'm sure she'll be talking about that amongst other things. Yeah. And I will be making reference to that this evening. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to share my slide screen with you, and hopefully this should work. If you bear with me, I'll just sort the technology out. You should hopefully be able to see my slides now.
Absolutely.
Great. So yes, I want to talk about what I think I'd refer to as places of hope. So often communities where I am in Wales, and indeed where you are in England and elsewhere, are written off. You know, we're very quick, I think, to point to their weaknesses, their failings, their shortcomings, their problems. And although I think it's right to not bury our heads in the sand and acknowledge where those communities are and the difficulties they face, it's also very important to me when doing these deep place studies to identify pathways for sustainable development. And by that I mean economic, yes, but also social, environmental and cultural. And those answers to me, which I'll be talking about this afternoon, are deeply rooted and highly localized. You know, they're place-specific answers, and they're very much based on the things that those places already have. So we talk about the economic, cultural, social, and environmental assets that those places already have. So the purpose, in a sense, of a deep place study isn't just to identify some of the weaknesses, but it's also to identify the opportunities and the possibilities that exist locally. I should acknowledge, again from the start, that I'm going to be talking about in the process of this one particular, the latest deep place study of Llandovery. I'll be coming on to that. And I do want to thank the Sustainable Places Research Institute for its support when I undertook that research a couple of years ago. I should also say that, as you say, I'm an honorary fellow there as well, although I work as an independent consultant. So all the things that I'm getting wrong this afternoon are entirely my fault. If I can fast forward the screen. There we go. There we go. So I want to pose critical questions here about how to identify both the opportunities and the barriers for sustainable development transformations to take hold. I want to suggest that this requires what we might term a grounded recoupling of livelihood resources. those based on social, economic, and ecological, and explorations as to how these resources in their differentiated place contexts can be both redefined and reassembled. It's long been recognized that placemaking is a contingent process of assembling and reassembling the bundles of hybrid resources that places hold, and how these bundles are arranged and mobilized so as to interact with exogenous forces. Here I want to explore the difficulties in developing a grounded recoupling approach through the lens of a series of, as I've indicated, my various deep place studies, which I've undertaken over the last 6 years. The first was in Tredegar, the second in Pontypool, the third, which we call a micro deep place study, because it was literally of one housing estate in Lansbury Park, which several years ago in the previous iteration of the Welsh Index, the multiple deprivation, won the race that no community wants to win, and that is it was the most deprived community in Wales, and therefore by extension one of the most deprived communities in the whole of the UK, and I would suggest probably in Western Europe. And the most recent study, which I will concentrate on a little later, at Llandovery in rural Carmarthenshire. These studies have identified some of the key structural obstacles and, as I suggest, the potential opportunities in developing sustainable placemaking, despite its urgency associated with climate change, resource depletion, and the need to arrest those growing spatial and social inequalities which we're so painfully aware of. I want to argue that through this analysis, it may be possible to regenerate these places by redefining, regrounding, and reallocating a range of social, natural, and economic resources. In order to do this, a change in the mindsets of what constitutes real, sustainable, and distributed development needs to take place. This requires, for me anyway, a jettisoning of the over-reliance upon what is increasingly being an outdated but still pernicious regional growth model, which rewards, I should say, economies of scale, agglomeration, and it seems the exaggerated benefits of centralization and concentration over more differentiated and distributed systems of the ecological economy. So, what is deep place? Well, deep place studies are grounded in and combine an empirical and normative concern with how to achieve more economically, socially, environmentally, and culturally sustainable places and communities. The approach is based on the premise that a properly functioning place or community should add to, rather than undermine, the social, environmental, and cultural sustainability of places and communities. Although it is not necessarily anti or even post-capitalist, deep place is concerned with the problems inherent in neoliberalism, which it seems is exploitative, for me anyway, of human and natural resources as mere factors of production. It argues that the economy is socially constructed and as such can therefore be socially reconstructed. I don't think that we should place limitations upon our ambition, and I'm not ever persuaded by people who say something can't be done. The economy isn't a natural phenomenon. It can be changed. It can do what we want it to do. Deep place does not, on the other hand, deny the complexities or the variable significance of global economic interrelationships. Indeed, it fully recognizes the difficulties and implications of managing and controlling these hugely complex interrelationships. That is why a deep place is place-based. It argues that more relocalized action based on a multiplicity of smaller choices can often have a significant impact on strengthening community resilience against these external forces. It, on the other hand, also contends that any response needs to be whole place. It needs to be coordinated and fully integrated. As I've indicated, it was initially developed by myself and Dave Adamson, who was my former boss and also a good friend, in Tredegar in South Wales in 2014. And subsequently 3 further studies were undertaken. Pontypool was undertaken in 2016, Lansbury Park in 2017, and most recently Llandovery in 2019. A further study of a UK city suburb is currently in early development. I can't say much more about that at this stage, but it will be the first opportunity to look at a suburb of a city. So if you look at those various settings, we've got effectively communities on the periphery to varying extents. They're deprived, they're former mining areas. They're rural communities which are being left behind in the agglomeration race. And this new city suburb, I should say, is a poor city suburb. So it's an area of a city. And the reason we're now doing this most recent one is to suggest that actually not all is rosy in the agglomeration thesis. Not all is rosy in these cities that we are told so often are the future of our economy and our society. Dave Adamson, I should add, is also currently undertaking additional studies in Newcastle, Australia, and Vanuatu. The central normative research question for each of these studies is, what type of economy and society do we need to create in this place, wherever that place is, to achieve economic, social, cultural, and environmental sustainability over the next generation? And that's an important point, that last point. This isn't a quick fix. This is a longer term process of gradually shifting these communities on a more sustainable path. Although some commonalities exist, the studies have identified a different set of responses to this question in each community. The research methods adopted have sought to be inclusive of a wide range of agencies and organisations that are involved in the various policy areas impacting on each community. There is also an attempt to ensure community participation in the studies, both directly through community-based workshops, but also indirectly through repeated engagement with local political representatives. The research methods are both, as you would expect, desk-based quantitative, but also partly ethnographic. Deep Place is by nature action-based research. It seeks to influence policy and delivery. Each study aims to be, therefore, a catalyst for progressive and positive change. And there is always an attempt to involve many of those who would be crucial to implement the transition advocated in the research within the research itself. The studies make use of official and, where available, other local data to build a statistical profile of the community as part of this model of understanding current challenges. But it has also been critical to go beyond the data, to establish, if you like, an understanding of the lived experience of each place. Upon establishing an understanding of the linkages between the social, economic, and environmental dimensions of each of the communities, the studies have sought to focus on existing assets that could be better utilised to make positive contributions to the community. Supporting this, a series of what I've called, and don't academics love a title, what I've called think spaces, which are effectively policy-themed, semi-structured focus groups involving not only experts and practitioners, but also community members. They are, therefore, co-productive in nature. Participants have included representatives of the various departments of local authorities, as you would expect, but also, as I've been doing these studies in Wales, representatives of Welsh Government, also representatives of health workers, the NHS, business owners, farmers, particularly important, of course, in the case of Llandovery, third sector groups, and also trade groups. The discussions in these have always been undertaken under Chatham House rules, and I found that to be the best approach to actually get people to have a free conversation around the table. So before I explore an abridged version, if you like, of the Llandovery study, I want to suggest that there are, for me, some underlying themes, critiques and influences which influence the way that I actually see the world, and which therefore influence the way that I undertake these deep place studies. And the first I would suggest is the problem with agglomerative growth. I vary between going between agglomerative growth and growth more generally, though perhaps that's another discussion for another time. Growth is the generally accepted measurement of economic progress by which government economic policy success tends to be judged by governments themselves, by opposition parties, by the media, by the public more generally, although it's seldom understood. It's assumed, though rarely explained, that because growth produced some worthwhile outcomes for a limited period of time, that it is always a desirable objective. The central assumption of economic policy, therefore, has been that everyone benefits from a growing economy. I would suggest there is increasing evidence, particularly in the so-called developed world, that that is simply not the case anymore. During the 1960s and 70s, I think there was much to support this perspective, as there was, I think it seems to me, a correlation between GDP per capita and some indicators of well-being, such as life expectancy, literacy rates. Today in the developed world, these correlations are far less clear. The main issue with growth, for me and others, as a measurement, appears to be its continued reliance on gross domestic product as the metric on which it is commonly assessed. GDP is defined, of course, by the ONS as the value of goods and services produced in a given period. Kuznets, who of course is credited with the development of GDP, suggested that anything detrimental to welfare, such as inequality, poverty, ecological degradation, should be excluded. However, the way that economic growth is calculated today ignores this warning. And consequently, it seems to me that GDP is not a good measure of economic well-being, as it fails to discriminate between both the costs and the benefits. There is a point, it seems, beyond which continued growth in GDP ceases to contribute to improvements in the quality of life within society and leads to unsustainable and inefficient inequalities. Growth has nothing to say about inequality, and as it depends, it seems, on more production and consumption, it would also appear to have little positive to contribute to environmental discussions. An alternative perspective is offered by the Capital Institute, which has argued that the systems-based mindset based on the idea of regenerative capitalism. This is why I've got a slightly ambivalent relationship toward capitalism per se. There does seem to be some interesting models being developed which may offer an alternative. The Capital Institute suggests that a one-size-fits-all answer simply doesn't exist. It suggests that each community consists of a mosaic of people's traditions, beliefs, and institutions that uniquely shaped long-term pressures of geology, human history, culture, local environment, and changing human needs. I don't think there's time here to explore some of the more interesting stuff around post-growth and degrowth, although I find that literature and those discussions extremely interesting. Another theme that influences the deep place approach is transition theory. The transition theory, the transition movement, for those of you who are not familiar with it, is concerned with the overall supply and use of energy from fossil fuel sources and the resulting carbon-based climate change. It assumes that society will soon reach a peak point in the supply of oil and that supply will thereafter diminish. The movement therefore asks, what must be done now to manage successfully the transition? In a process usually referred to as backcasting, transition thinking asks what future state we wish to achieve, and then asks what must be new now in order to achieve it in a planned way. It suggests economic relocalization will be one of the inevitable impacts of the end of cheap transportation fuels. We must produce, they suggest, more of the necessities close by anyway, why not make the immediate community the source and the focus of our entire energy transition strategy? Another issue is resilience. This is, of course, a state where communities are in control of the production to meet their needs. Also seems to be important within the transition thinking. It represents the capacity of communities to hold together and to function despite external shocks and pressures. Core ideas of fuel and food security derive from the concept of resilience and suggest a diminishing reliance on extended supply chains that are both precarious and environmentally costly. I would suggest that although necessary and indeed laudable, the ability of the transition movement to achieve the necessary systemic change is unfortunately insufficient. Whereas transition thinking appears to separate the citizen from the state and regards aggregated individual action, it seems to me, as the source of global change, I would suggest that a successful transition will require the central and local state to develop green infrastructure and also to incentivize sustainable consumption patterns. I'm certainly not rejecting transition thinking and very much embrace it. I just don't think it's entirely sufficient on its own to achieve that transition. Another theme that I think influences my perspective on deep place is total place. Total place is the term applied to a specific approach to public service reform. I believe that it was initially developed from work conducted at the Leadership Centre for Local Government, where 13 pilot projects were undertaken between 2008 and 2010. Total place thinking celebrates that there is no one approach or method. Instead, it assumes that the circumstances of each place will determine the kinds of actions that emerge. The approach sought to create higher public value in the provision of services, which better meet the needs of recipients, whilst also improving performance and accountability of service providers. Total place appears to be informed by a range of approaches, including things like chaos theory, systems theory, change theory, and leadership theory, which together create an approach that seeks to deliver services to communities in a holistic, integrated, and collaborative way. As well as influencing a deep place approach, total place appears to be entirely consistent with the Wellbeing of Future Generations Wales Act 2015, which seeks, amongst other things, to change the way that public services are delivered across Wales. As I said at the outset, I think you've got Jane Davidson coming soon, and I'm sure she will talk in more detail about the Wellbeing Act. I'm happy to, in discussions afterwards, maybe if anyone wants to ask any questions about that, add a few comments, but I'm not going to elaborate now further on that. Okay, so an abridged, if you like, case study of Llandovery. The central assumption of deep place is that every place is different, as I've said. It's a unique combination of social, natural, and economic resources that are place specific. Commonalities clearly exist between places of similar character, but each community has its own unique range of assets, challenges, and opportunities. Deep place is based on an empirical case study undertaken at a spatial level where each community can be better understood. The three previous UK place studies, deep place studies, had been undertaken within an urban post-industrial environment. Llandovery is actually a small market town, and this was therefore the first opportunity to apply the approach within a rural region and context. And it seems to me that actually there's been a surprising lack of research into small market towns. And given that rural communities across the UK are facing multiple challenges, this, it seems to me, is a significant shortcoming. Llandovery in Carmarthenshire was selected as an appropriate rural community to further test and refine the deep place methodology, as well as contributing to the broader lack of evidence concerning small market towns and rural communities more generally. Llandovery consists of just 2 lower super output areas, and although broader contextual issues were considered, these were used as the primary focus for the data collection in the study. The 2 LSOAs on the map here are Llandovery 1, which includes the northern part of the town and the rural areas to the north and east, and Llandovery 2 to the southern part of the town and the rural areas to the south and to the west. Llandovery 1 is comparatively more disadvantaged than Llandovery 2. It rates particularly poorly in the access to services domain within the Welsh Index of multiple deprivation. I'm just going to pop that next slide up so you can see an extract from the 2014 iteration, which was the latest available when we were doing the Llandovery study. For those of you who aren't familiar, the Welsh Index of multiple deprivation is undertaken by Welsh Government. It was last undertaken in 2019 now, so there is a newer version, a newer iteration. It's an indicator of relative rather than absolute deprivation. And each of Wales's 1,909 LSOAs are ranked, and the top 10% of the most deprived, as you'll see on the colour code on the slide, neither of the Llandovery LSOA fall within the top 30% most deprived, though Llandovery 1 does fall within the 30 to 50% most deprived in Wales. So I would add that actually rural deprivation and poverty, there is an argument for suggesting it is often missed in calculations of this nature, and there's a whole debate about that. But nevertheless, they offer you a snapshot. This is where the 2 LSOA fall within the study area. I'm just going to skip forward. As I was suggesting, the Llandovery 1 does score quite badly in the access to services domain, as you would suggest in a rural area, though interestingly and contrastingly, Llandovery 2 right next door doesn't. And I think that's probably one of the vagaries of actually undertaking this in large rural settings. Llandovery is located, as I suggested, in rural Carmarthenshire. It's around 30 miles northeast of Carmarthen on the edge of the Brecon Beacons National Park, and is one of the county's market towns. Its historic role was as a drover's town, and it's located at the intersection of 3 historically significant droving routes. And this cemented not only its strong links to the agricultural community, which continue to exist today and largely determine its role in terms of its local economic function, but also its provision of facilities as a market town, which have more recently led to its appeal to tourists, particularly as its close proximity to the Brecon Beacons National Park. It has a population of 2,600 people and a population density of 22 people per square kilometre, which is obviously hugely contrasting with those urban areas that we previously looked at. Population change that took place between 2011 and 2017 witnessed a reduction of 4.6%. The local population is generally older than the Welsh average, and it is significantly more noticeable in rural Llandovery 1, where around 5% fewer children and 13% more people over the age of 65 than the Wales and Carmarthenshire averages. Carmarthenshire in general has an ageing population, and on current trajectories, by 2039, 1 in 3 residents will be aged 65 and older. For those of you who aren't familiar with Wales, the Welsh language plays an active and important role in this community. and is used as a working language by many people and businesses in the community. For many people, Welsh is spoken as a first language, and at the time of the last census, at least, around half of the population had at least some Welsh language skills, and that is significantly higher than the Welsh average. The largest sectors within the population are employed include construction, wholesale and retail, repair of motor vehicles and motorcycles, education, human services, social work, and particularly in Llandovery 1, agriculture, forestry and fishing. The private sector economy of Carmarthenshire is overwhelmingly one that is based on micro and small businesses. There are, in fact, only 85 businesses in Carmarthenshire that employ more than 55 people, and of these, just 20 businesses employ more than 250 people. Self-employment also accounts for a substantial amount of economic activity in Llandovery. The most recent local data I have is from the 2011 census, where self-employment accounted for 15.9% of local employment, and this is likely to have increased since then, as between 2007 and 2016, self-employment across the UK actually grew from 3.6 million to 4.33 million, and accounted for 44% of all jobs growth. During the same period, self-employment in Wales increased from 161,000 to 176,000, which represented 38% of total jobs growth. There are 184 properties that are assessed for non-domestic rates, business rates if you like, in Llandovery. The largest individual category usage are shop and retail, storage and warehousing, and automotive and office. Collectively, hospitality and retail related activities, it seems to me, represent by far the largest proportion of property uses. The rateable value for each of these properties is extremely low, and just 4 properties have a rateable value above £50,000. As I suggested, there is a lot more data, I should suggest, in the report, and I will put a link at the end of this presentation to where you can access the full report. I'm not going to go over all that detail now, but as I did suggest, actually there are in each community local opportunities for grounded recoupling. There are, if you like, foundational assets that can be developed and used to create more socially, economically, environmentally, and culturally sustainable communities. And Llandovery is no exception to this. The Deep Place study explored the progressive development and redefinition of key areas in this respect of the foundational economy, which is another theme that does underpin a lot of our Deep Place work. Foundation economics has been part of all of the Deep Place studies to date, beginning with Tredegar in 2014, and we were pleased to have Carol Williams, who was one of the leaders of the team that kind of developed the foundation economy approach, speak at our launch conference, as well as part of our group that we established to support that particular study. Those areas include and combine food, energy, energy conservation, care, the environment, as well as a growth of e-commerce and distributed employment patterns. And I want to explore just some of these in turn now, starting with food. The production and supply of food must, it seems to me, form a core part of any sustainable placemaking agenda. Although representing a significant element of household expenditure, little of the average weekly household spend on groceries by residents of Llandovery is actually located outside of the major supermarkets. And I think this is typical of the wider trend across the whole of the UK. This pattern of production and distribution has led to an increasing concern about food security and food quality, of course. The transition movement has identified that food production as an example of an unsustainable model on current economic processes. The issues of food miles has entered public consciousness, and as a result, global supply chains have been called into question. Although it seems to me there are occasional, and I think largely middle class, consumer engaged, though it seems rarely consumer-led campaigns that affect marginal changes in this respect, they've never really threatened the basic elements of the model. As a result, I think there's been a decline in local food production and distribution chains in favour of supermarket-controlled global supply chains, and I see little on scale anyway to actually arrest this trend. There are alternative approaches emerging. Some of the most noticeable are in the USA, where there has been a steady growth in the number of food hubs, which are now working to aggregate and distribute source-identified foods products. These are significant in the effort to develop local economies, tackle poverty, achieve environmental transition, and contribute to sustainable placemaking agendas more generally. Food hubs are also becoming fully commercially viable businesses and are making it possible for smaller agricultural producers to access larger markets. The Cleveland Green City Growers Initiative is probably one of the most famous examples of a local food hub initiative. However, despite these very laudable initiatives, the kind of radical change needed to significantly affect the current model is still absent. Alongside supermarket supply chains radically changing their current supply mechanisms, a more localized food economy will require a major shift in consumption patterns. It is difficult to see either of these happening at scale without government intervention and wider societal recognition of the need for change. It is worth just mentioning that the majority of farming in and around Llandovery is upland, with 30% of produce being exported, and 95% of those exports exported formally within the European Union. The second local opportunity, it seems to me, is around energy and energy efficiency. Transition thinking assumes that fossil fuel-derived energy supply is unlikely to be feasible as a basis for future fuel security. Indeed, the UK is already heavily dependent on the import of liquid gas for a significant proportion of its electricity generating capacity and domestic supply. Concerns around energy security parallel concerns about rising fuel poverty. The UK government has also effectively, it seems, outsourced investment in green energy infrastructure. State investment is also historically low and is falling even further. Energy is a core element in the foundation economy. Although it is one that is currently dominated by multinational utility corporations and, as a consequence, is subject to a significant degree of international capital seeking, it seems to me, significant maximum financial returns. Energy conservation and generation, however, offer opportunities to support the development of more sustainable local economies. The Environment Wales Act contains 3 natural resource policy priorities, which have been reiterated more recently in Welsh Government's draft Climate Change Adaptation Delivery Plan. And these include increasing renewable energy and resource efficiency, delivering nature-based solutions, and taking a place-based approach. Any move toward a more sustainable energy system must clearly include a concerted effort to conserve energy. Energy efficiency at a community level can be significantly improved, it seems to me, through the retrofitting of existing housing stock. The Committee on Climate Change has suggested that we will not meet our targets for emissions reduction without near complete decarbonising of the housing stock of the UK. Energy use in homes accounts for 14% of UK greenhouse gas emissions. This combination of improving home energy efficiency and strengthening local economies offer opportunities to improve equitable socio-economic outcomes for the most vulnerable households. In 2016, 23% of all households in Wales experienced fuel poverty. That is to say, those that had to spend more than 10% of household income on fuel costs, with 3% of those households experiencing severe fuel poverty, therefore spending more than 20% of income on fuel costs. There's a strong consensus that living in a cold home would have lasting impacts on health, educational attainment, and the social aspects of residents' lives. And households with older people, children, disabled people, and people with limited long-term illnesses, including people with respiratory and circulatory diseases, or people with mental health conditions, are most vulnerable and tend to have lower incomes. The Welsh Government's Nest Home Energy Efficiency Scheme, which provides fully funded improvements to target low-income owner-occupied houses, and the Welsh Housing Quality Standard, which is being taken forward in the socially rented sector in Wales, are indeed helping to address these issues in Wales. Unlike renewable generation, where the bulk of spending leaks from local areas, and in this context Wales and Carmarthenshire, much of the spending on domestic refurbishment is captured locally. In part, this is a result of the more labour-intensive nature of refurbishment work, but also due to generic technologies that Wales has a commercial capacity to produce. It's been calculated that an investment of 1.1 billion in domestic refurbishment for energy saving could create 33,000 person-years of employment in Wales. Over a 15-year period, this would equate to 2,200 full-time jobs on average in areas such as construction, related skills trades, and professional services such as surveying, planning, and engineering. Community energy generation offers a means for rural communities in particular to generate income streams which can be used to subsidise energy costs or other community benefits. Concerns have been raised about the difficulties in bringing such schemes forward in Wales, and community renewable energy schemes comprise of less than 0.5% of Welsh renewables capacity, and the situation is likely to worsen given the changes of the UK government's support towards renewables. Another area which I'd like to touch on briefly is health and social care. And health and social care is often seen as a problem, particularly social care, but I tend to see it as an opportunity. It's a core part of the foundation economy again. In the UK, over 70% of adult community care is provided by the independent sector. A report by Kresk in 2016 showed weaknesses in this sector and the apparent unsustainability of adult community care that arise from the profit extracted by large chains that currently control the sector. There are other models. Carmarthenshire County Council recently took over the direct delivery of some of the county's community care provision following the collapse of one of its private sector contractors. The council may wish, of course, in the longer term, that it wishes to deliver community care directly as a core public service, but other options exist. There is a significant international evidence to suggest of the benefits that can accrue from alternative cooperative models of community care provision. In Bologna, for example, 85% of social care services are provided by cooperatives. And the experience in Bologna, as well as that of other locations like Quebec, help illustrate that social business models can lead to better innovation and the reinvestment of surplus. Despite the objectives contained within the Welsh Social Services and Wellbeing Act to create a more mixed economy of provision in health and social care, the take-up and the delivery through social business models remains quite low. The potential of alternative social business models for adult community care provision are considerable, and they can deliver higher standards of care and improve working conditions and terms of employment. But they can also make the future community care provision more viable, and ultimately, it seems to me, improve local economic outcomes as a result of better paid, locally employed workforce. And finally, I want to touch on the redefining of nature and the environment, which underpins deep place studies. The Welsh Government projections on climate change indicate that by 2050, the daily maximum temperatures in summer in Wales will increase by 2.4 Celsius, whilst daily minimum temperatures in winter will increase by 2.5 Celsius. Under this scenario, rainfall in winter will increase by on average 14%. Wales, I assure you, doesn't need a great deal more rainfall, and decrease in summer by 16%. While accepting the need to prepare for the impacts of climate change, Welsh Government has also argued that it is necessary to limit the cause by reducing emissions of greenhouse gases, such as carbon dioxide. The Environment Wales Act places a duty on Welsh Government to ensure that by 2050, net emissions are at least 80% lower than the baseline set in legislation. However, it has indicated it wishes to exceed this target. Similarly, the Carmarthenshire Wellbeing Plan also acknowledges the need to act to ensure ecosystem resilience and promote the values of the circular economy. And in a statement by Welsh Government in 2016, it also acknowledged the importance of the circular economy for Wales more generally, claiming that it could create and contribute at £2 billion per year to the Welsh economy. There is, however, a growing belief that important and crucial though the circular economy is, it is only part of the solution to address environmental degradation. For example, interest in what has been termed regenerative agriculture is growing. And this describes farming and grazing practices that reverse climate change by rebuilding soil organic matter and restoring degraded soil biodiversity, resulting in carbon drawdown and improving the water cycle. Regenerative agriculture not only does no harm to the land, but actually seeks to improve it. In the context of planning for the post-Brexit landscape, Welsh Government proposed two different funds to replace the basic payment scheme of the Common Agricultural Policy. One was an ecosystem resilience scheme, which would provide investment for economic activities, and in particular food and timber production. And the other was the public goods scheme, providing support for public goods delivery, particularly relating to the environment. Opinions on the suitability of such approaches in the area of Llandovery are divergent, and these were voiced during the deep place study. Some feel that the nature of the local landscape in the countryside around Llandovery limits the extent of diversification that could take place to potentially only timber. Other options supported the growing interest in more environmentally sensitive and less intensive forms of farming, which perhaps also more readily lend themselves to smaller scale distributed production. The distributed economy is linked to the bio-based economy due to the locality of biomass production and the low sustainability of transportation over long distances. This means that local production in close proximity to raw materials is important. In the distributed economy, the basic needs such as food and energy should, as far as possible, be produced locally. Local production reduces the impact of global market changes and increases local resilience. In the closer integration of people, towns, and the environment, the importance of natural resources becomes far more clearly understood. There are significant land assets in and around Llandovery, as indeed there are in other areas, that are in public ownership. In Carmarthenshire, the Welsh government forest estate accounts to 5% of the total land area. So, to draw these observations to a close, I want to argue to give places a chance to create local coalitions and local action plans to overcome the barriers and to reground local assets. The application of a deep place approach to Llandovery has sought to identify the range of local assets and the challenges that currently constrain the town. It has also attempted to identify opportunities about how these foundational assets, food, energy, health, nature, can and need to be actively regrounded, redefined and recoupled so that they could contribute to the long-term economic, social, environmental and cultural sustainability of Llandovery and other communities like it. In this respect, it is consistent with the spirit of the Wellbeing of Future Generations Wales Act. The essential contribution, therefore, that the Llandovery Deep Place study sought to make is to argue that there needs to be a radical shift in approach towards sustainable placemaking that is more holistic, place-based and longer term. The conventional economic logic of agglomeration and centralisation for growth and the overriding emphasis on infrastructure and investment-ready skills bases in economic and regional policy offers little to the sustainable placemaking agenda. Indeed, we can see that the very existence and dominance of this urban-based economic model works to the detriment of not only rural areas like Llandovery, but also dispersed market communities, smaller towns like Tredegar and Pontypool. It has, for instance, reinforced the logic of economies of scale, not just in farming, forestry, energy, care services and retail, but also in the former distributed public services of schooling, medical care, banking, community facilities like libraries and transport. There is no current whole place plan for communities like Llandovery. The Llandovery Deep Place study has laid the groundwork for the development of such a plan, but the next and more detailed phases must be co-productive and seek to involve the local community in its broadest sense. In that respect, the study sought to suggest that the first step should be the establishment of a coalition for change, which should be co-productive in nature and involve representatives from the local communities, businesses, voluntary sector, public services, and directly with community members. In analysing the available evidence and on engaging with the local community, businesses and policymakers, the study suggests a number of key instrumental replacing actions that the Coalition for Change may wish to consider in order to relocalise and redistribute local economic activities. I'm not going to go through these in great detail, but I will just pick out just a couple of themes that we do discuss in the report. One of which is the ageing population. Another is the need to encourage in-migration whilst not undermining the local culture. There's also a need to support sustainable forms of local enterprise development based on indigenous local businesses and existing levels, high levels of self-employment. The creation of things like low-cost business hubs would be useful. In rural areas like Llandovery, broadband is a major issue which needs to be addressed. There are issues around transport that exist in rural areas, potentially more so than in urban areas. Not everything will be delivered or accessible within Llandovery. There is a railway line that serves Llandovery. It's quite rare, I think, amongst rural communities, but it's an infrequent service, so that will need to be addressed. And another major issue is the availability of housing supply. There are around 1,200 households in Llandovery, but although property prices are very low, income is also very low. The poverty rate in Llandovery is around 39%, and there has been very little new housing development over a long period in Llandovery. So, in conclusion, the application of a deep place approach to different types of rural and post-industrial communities becomes critical in refocusing and redefining their particular and distinctive sets of natural and socio-cultural assets, as well as their economic assets. More than ever, as we move, it seems to me, to the contested post-carbonised world, the very relocalised distinctiveness and indeed politics and planning of a place will become all the more necessary to explore through such approaches. Such approaches need to give voice and power and local visioning and regional visioning, seems to me, in a co-productive way. Increasingly in the midst of these transitions, I think we should jettison our often implicit and sometimes explicit assumptions about the so-called efficiencies of agglomerative and centralised growth. It seems to me that the post-carbonised future will need to be distributed, and as such, places should not be rendered peripheral when they display innate and different varieties of eco-ecological assets upon which a post-carbon society can be built. In this sense, scholars need to embrace deep place type approaches that fundamentally challenge conventional spatial logics and, I would argue, outmoded theories. And I should just put up that final slide. As I indicated, the Llandovery report is available. I think these slides are going to be shared anyway, so you'll be able to take note of those. I've got a website. They're also on Cardiff University's website and my ResearchGate, and I've also been known to send out the occasional tweet, should anyone wish to follow that as well. But thank you very much for listening, and I hope it's been in some way useful.
Well, thank you very much, Mark, for that fantastic talk. And it's always very inspiring, actually, to hear how far ahead of the curve Wales is in so many of these issues. And of course, many of us took a lot of inspiration from the original Tredegar report. And then much of what you've been talking about chimes, I think, very well with some work that we've been doing on livelihoods in the IGP. And I think the team will be getting excitable about asking you a few questions about that. But if we could start with a little bit of a chat between you and me whilst they're thinking about things. So, one of the things you said at the beginning is that these changes, they're very doable, but they take a little bit of time. So one question then, putting this into the time frame, say, of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, so 2030. So how much progress can we make in Wales by 2030? I mean, can we turn around what's happening in Blaenau Gwent by 2030, for example? What's your feeling about timeframes?
I think it depends on what we mean by turning things around. Mm-hmm. I think there are things that we need to do, and there are things that we need to stop doing.
Right.
And it seems to me both are equally important. The agglomerative logic hasn't happened by accident. It's been supported. It's been, in many cases, funded. And in some cases funded quite a lot by the public sector. And yes, Wales is very much in so many ways ahead of the curve. We do have the Wellbeing Future Generations Act, which should influence all devolved public policy in Wales. And that's important. And I'm a critical friend, I think it's fair to say, of Welsh policy and Welsh government. I'm conscious I can be a thorn in the side occasionally, but that's because I passionately believe in certain things. But I'm not denying that they have done great things. So is it possible to achieve meaningful transition by 2030? Yes, it is, most definitely. But we need to stop, and use the example of Blaenau Gwent, we need to stop doing things like putting all our eggs in the basket of inward investment. I'll give you one brief example. Several years ago, there was a proposal to create a so-called Circuit of Wales in Blaenau Gwent, which, for those of you not familiar, and why would you be? This is a very Welsh local thing. There was a proposal by a private sector developer to build a motor racing track near Ebervale in Blaenau Gwent, which is just along the heads of the valleys from Tredegar, where we did the first study. In fact, these proposals were very much live when we were doing the Tredegar study, and you will note, if you've ever read the Tredegar study, we did not reference it, because at that time we did not believe it was part of the future, and I continue to believe it wasn't part of the future. Now, that circuit never happened, but for a long period of time, a lot of the policy priorities of both the local authority and indeed Welsh government, well-meaning though they were about this particular proposal. So a lot of effort, a lot of policy effort was put into supporting this proposal. Well, it never happened. At one point, I went for a walk along Ebervale High Street. I used to live in Ebervale for several years. And someone had placed in a locked, it's important to note this, a locked public notice board. So it wasn't a random member of the public, a sign. And on this sign, it basically said in big black text, "Pray for the Circuit of Wales," which is both funny, but also desperately sad. And for so many years, effectively summed up the local economic policy strategy for Blaenau Gwent. We need to stop praying for the Circuit of Wales and look more locally. And unless we do that, we will not achieve a meaningful change by 2030. If we do that, then there are a multiplicity of smaller things that we can do, which might just start turning the balance in that timescale.
Yes, and it's probably the question of the smaller thing that's important, because of course one of the things about the deep place approach, or about any place-based approach, is understanding the relationship to larger determinants. So Wales, like a lot of parts of the United Kingdom, has had a long history now of deindustrialization. And for example, where we're working in Barking and Dagenham in East London, there are a lot of people who are waiting for the car factory to come back, as the answer to the problem. So it's a very similar kind of problem. But understanding that larger set of determinants can be quite important, because of course, I mean, you can make changes at the local level, but you can't necessarily always deal with the impact, which can be very great, of these larger determinants in a specific place. And that's much harder, isn't it? So thinking about that, I mean, how do you, looking outwards from Tredegar or Llandovery or any of the places where you've been working, I mean, what do you feel about the sort of larger changes that would be needed? I mean, there are place-based ones, but also larger ones that would have to go alongside.
There are signals that certainly Welsh government is shifting its economic policy stance. There is a lot of interest in the foundational economy in Wales. Wales is probably further ahead on that path than anywhere. You know, it has a strong champion in one of the junior economic development ministers at the heart of Welsh government. It's increasingly understood that Wales should not be engaged in a race to the bottom. You know, there's competition for any jobs at any cost, which has defined Welsh economic policy for the last 40 years. We're moving away from that now. Places need to stop competing, it seems to me. If we all stop competing and issuing, you know, financial incentive or infrastructural incentive to footloose global capital, you know, and start investing in our own places, then I think we can achieve some generic change. And in any respect, we're going to have to, whether we like it or not. We are in an environmental crisis of global proportion. You know, it's no longer sustainable to continue to do the things that we have been doing. And some people will point to the fact that South Wales has a residual manufacturing base. It does.
Yeah.
And I'm not suggesting that isn't important as a local employer, or that, you know, Welsh policy shouldn't engage with it, like other areas of the UK and elsewhere. But we're only just dipping our toe in those alternative models. And it seems to me, and I will say this, it hasn't stopped Welsh Government trying to ride two horses. You know, on the one hand, it will talk the talk about foundation economy, and in some respects will put some money behind that too, and some policy. But on the other hand, Wales has an airport which is owned by Welsh Government. It recently gave Aston Martin a substantial sum of money to come to Wales. And lo and behold, Aston Martin announced that it was shedding 200 jobs from its Welsh operation yesterday. You know, there are long scars in that kind of approach, which Welsh Government hasn't yet learned.
Yes, I know. And that it's a terrible problem across the whole of the UK, but particularly brutal for Wales, I know. But this idea of giving people either tax breaks or building them infrastructure, or giving them sometimes wadges of cash, basically, to turn up is one of the most iniquitous parts of these things. When we think about the place-based approaches, and we're thinking about you know, the ecological services that are around us, and the kind and the potential there for food, you know, so some of us might think of Welsh lamb or various other things if we're thinking about Carmarthenshire. But the other side of this is it does depend a little bit, doesn't it, exactly where you are, because when the town of Albi in southern France announced that it was going to have local value chains for all its restaurants restricted to 50 kilometers from the town, some wag pointed out that this worked well for Albi because it's surrounded by vineyards, right? But had it not been, it might have been rather less popular. Right? So there is an issue, isn't there, about how to understand how to develop these local value chains, because of necessity, they can't all be totally local.
No, they can't, and they also can't all be based on the same model. So that's your example is an interesting. Another one closer to home is Hay-on-Wye. You know, and for some years, every market town suddenly had to become, you know, a book town. You know, and you know, it works well for Hay. You know, Abergavenny works as a kind of food town. You know, and that's great. But you know, Tredegar, Pontypool are not Abergavenny and Hay.
No.
And their local circumstances are different. Their catchment populations have far less money, you know, and that's why it's important, I think, to be place-based. You know, we can't all follow the same strategy. We have to do what's right for us based on what we have. Yeah.
Well, diversity, I think, is a strength, but it will require a certain element of redistribution, either market or by some kind of distributive measure, which is an issue. Well, perhaps we should open it up a little bit, because I think people want to ask a few questions. So the first question is from Sawaj Jaya Singh, who's asking, what is your view, Mark, on the number of small towns seeking to be smart? Is this something to be welcomed or wary of? I think this is technology smart.
Yeah, technology smart. Yeah, technology is one of those things, isn't it? We often see it as an inevitable. You know, we often see these forces as inevitable. It comes back to this point about actually the economy is socially constructed. So technology is a wonderful thing, but it's there to serve us and our needs. And therefore, towns that want to be smart, great, you know. But we have to be sure that actually the nature of that smartness is something that serves our own needs. Otherwise, there's a danger, and I think that this is implied in the question. I think there's a danger that we replace one set of global forces that we find difficult to control with another set of global forces that we find difficult to control. So it can be a force for good, but we have to be wary. You know, I'm not suggesting, to broaden this, I'm not suggesting that we suddenly, and I think this was implicit in your example, I'm not suggesting we suddenly throw barriers and boundaries around every town and every community. and suggest that, you know, we can't be global, we should be global. Cultural globality, I'm inventing a word here, but cultural globalism is a force for good in many respects, as long as we can protect our indigenous kind of cultures. Welsh language, of course, is a classic example of that. You know, we do need to be wary that actually we're not all speaking American English because we all watch American films and nothing else. Not that I've got anything against America, but the point is, you know, we need to be, to some extent, but nevertheless, we also need to share and learn cultural experiences. So let's not throw boundaries. And the traded sector, there's nothing inherently wrong in, you know, me on a special occasion buying a bottle of French champagne. What's wrong with that? You know, equally, there are some very good sparkling whites that come out of the Camel Valley in Cornwall, which I love. You know.
Ah, okay. Good.
Well, then there's an advert. I have no share interest, I should say, in the Camel Valley.
Very good. Well, let's turn now to a question from Maurizio Marinelli, and he's saying, thank you for the thought-provoking talk. I was wondering if you could expand on the existing consultative processes within the local community. I imagine that they are or could be enhanced by the deep place approach as opposed to the total place one. Would you be able to give us an example of consultation mechanisms in relation to a specific sector, for example, the agri-food system or health and social care or something else?
Yeah, I'm going to mention this in reference to the Wellbeing Act. The Wellbeing Future Generations Wales Act has changed, or at least should change, or should have changed, the way that public policy is made in Wales. And it's supposed to have democratized, and this, by the way, is a question you may want to ask Jane Davidson when she comes to speak to you. She will be able to talk to you in far greater knowledge of this than I. But it seems to me that what the Act sought to do, one of its so-called 5 ways of working, was to involve more people, to engage local communities, to be more productive. I think generally in some policy areas, Wales is quite co-productive. In others, far less so. Economic development, I do not think, is in any way co-productive. I think this is the sector that, in a sense, has kind of, you know, bypassed this mechanism. I'll describe a little bit more the deep place approach to engagement activities, and this is relevant because the Tredegar study was being undertaken and developed at exactly the same time that the Wellbeing Future Generations Act in Wales was being developed. And I might be so bold as to suggest there has been some cross-fertilization between those two processes. And so the 5 ways of working in particular that are contained within the Act, I think, are echoed in the approach Deep Place takes. We, as I suggested, we do the data analysis, and that's fine, and, you know, good research is based on good data. But we undertake these co-productive workshops, these think spaces. And I've always insisted that not only policymakers and practitioners and businesses from various sectors are represented, but also direct community participation is represented in each of these think spaces. So I will, as part of a study, undertake, for example, a health and social services, social care think space. Right. I will undertake an economic one. I will undertake, etc., an agricultural one. To some extent, the importance of each of those things varies from place to place. So, and indeed the theme and the themes within each will vary from place to place. But that approach, it seems to me, is tied closely to the Wellbeing Act. Just briefly, to finish on this, each of the local authorities in Wales has a wellbeing plan. Some of them have actually merged their wellbeing plans, but nevertheless, generally each will have a wellbeing plan and will have a public services board to develop it, a wellbeing board to take that forward. That wellbeing board consists of people from the public sector, as you would imagine, but also some representatives of the third sector. What is absent, and I've never understood why this is the case, is the private sector.
Mm.
And I gave a presentation a couple of years ago to one of the boards, and I did this thing where I asked everyone in the audience, one of these boards, who was a member of the public sector, to put their hands up, and most of the room put their hands up. And then I asked everyone, the third sector, to raise their hands, and a couple put their hands up. And then I asked everyone from the business sector, and no one put their hands up. And I said to them, is it possible, do you think, that we can design a well-being plan for this community or for these communities without reference to the private sector? And of course it isn't. So that for me is a major flaw in the well-being legislation in Wales.
Yeah, no, I can see that, and we can talk more about that in a moment. Let me bring in my colleague Matt Davies, who is on the panel, so he can ask his question in person. Matt.
Thanks, Henrietta, and Diolch yn fawr, Mark. That was wonderful. Thank you very much. Thoroughly enjoyed it. And I mean, I just wanted a couple of comments first, because I thought they were so very smartly made. So the example of the circuit for Wales was just a wonderful illustration of some of the challenges here. And having grown up in the area and having seen the impact and the focus on LG coming in Panasonic coming in, and the kids that I went to school with almost reorienting their visions of the future and their future careers around those things. You know, so you're 16 and you're playing rugby with a group of guys, and all of a sudden you say, what are you going to do with your lives? And they say, well, we'll get a job at Panasonic because Panasonic's coming in. And all of that emphasis then being on that external investment with no real belief amongst anyone within the community that there can be self-generated jobs and value and livelihoods from within the community itself. And I think part of that is possibly that post-industrial sort of hangover and mentality, but also the real lack of any investment in building that ambition and belief almost. And I mean, I say this as the only person in my sixth form that went to university outside of Wales, and the only one of 4 who went to university in total, and that was from an A-level sixth form. So your example is a wonderful one. So my question really then is, firstly, about education, and what would your take be there on the role of education, you know, which is very, very good in Welsh schools. And I had a great sort of education in terms of passing my A-levels and my GCSEs, etc. But what I wasn't taught was how to have self-belief and to be inspired to do things that think outside the box. And then perhaps secondly, and perhaps related to that, was just what are some of your experiences when you put these ideas more concretely to local people, when you ask them about distributed economy or localized economy? What are the kinds of responses? Do you get the sense there's a belief that these things can actually happen?
Okay. I'm going to answer that second bit first, if you don't mind, comment on it. It's varied. People have been told people have been persuaded over a very long time about what the economy is. And I think typically, maybe less so Llandovery, which is slightly different, but certainly in Tredegar, Pontypool, and to some extent in Lansbury Park, and in other communities where I've done work that isn't deep place. I've done a lot of it, as you would imagine, in South Wales. There is an ingrained culture, because people have been told this for so long, that actually what we need is originally a large public sector investment, the mines, for example, and more latterly, over the last 40 years, certainly a post-industrial private sector investment of the nature that you described. You know, like you, I was brought up in Port Talbot, and of course, Port Talbot is steel town. To some extent, still is steel town, though maybe not to the extent that it was before. You know, and I come from a steel-making family. You know, father, grandfather, great-grandfather were all employed in some form in a steel industry, and was the first to go to university too. that locally ingrained assumption skews people's conceptions about what the local economy can be. It's still heavily ingrained. There was genuinely a real kind of conviction and belief that actually this circuit of Wales, like LG before it, which is of course the other classic example in South Wales, Aston Martin, coming to the Vale of Glamorgan, and many others, were going to be the answer to all our problems. And it's very difficult to get over that. But actually, when you drill into in these kind of meaningful conversations with people, what it is that's important to them in terms of what they get out of the economy, they're looking for meaningful employment. They're looking for an end, many of them, to struggling, hand-to-mouth struggling, and to some extent not even that. Let's not forget the growth of food banks in South Wales and elsewhere. So they're looking for a livelihood for their children. So they're looking for all of those things that actually we all want from a sustainable economy. So if we look at what it is people want from an economy rather than what they think an economy is, then I think there's a lot of opportunity to engage with them about ends rather than means. It's also interesting, by the way, when you ask them what is growth, which I occasionally do, very few of them are able to answer that question. They just assume that growth, you've got to have growth. Growth is good. Growth is good. I've been on Welsh radio a little while ago. I went on Welsh radio and I put a report out there saying that actually growth was potentially not necessarily a good thing and we should stop talking about it. And the Welsh media basically put me on there and introduced me as this nutter. I'm paraphrasing here, they weren't quite this mean, but this nutter who basically was turning the world on its head and basically saying, well, actually, we've always been told the growth is good, but actually there's someone coming along saying it shouldn't be. Occasionally you throw these little these things over the wall, don't you? And people do think, well, actually, yeah, what is growth? And they go away and they kind of, the reason that's important is they challenge the messages that are constantly reinforced by politicians, policymakers, and the media about what is good for the economy. And that takes us nicely into the other part of your question about education. Yeah, there are some fantastic bits to the Welsh education system. My God, I was lucky enough to have some cracking bits, particularly, I would say, in my case, since leaving school, my further education experience was brilliant. It really launched me into higher education, and I'm very grateful to Cardiff University for what it did for my education as well. There has been some really interesting things in terms of further education that have come out recently. I was involved in a report, a small part of a piece of research, which looked at how further education sector in Wales can actually move from simply supply into active labour market management. FE in Wales has been told for so long that actually it needs to warehouse skills ready for investment. So the FE sector geared up its kind of skills training to meet the Circuit of Wales and has done with all the others. More recently, it's starting to question some of that logic, and that's an exciting development, I think. That report, by the way, is also, I popped it on my website, so on that slide you'll see it there. It's a Colegau Cymru report. And the other thing I don't think, and this maybe answers both bits of your question that we do enough in Wales, and this may be true elsewhere, is value entrepreneurship. One of the bits of data that I put up in my presentation was about the growth of self-employment, and there has been a growth in self-employment in Wales. I don't think that we celebrate that enough. And I think potentially that is a large part of changing our economic policy direction in Wales to something that is more locally rooted, to something that is less footloose, to something that the people who are the wealth generators locally are local people themselves.
Great. Well, we have a question that in a way perhaps comes off that from Bridget Story, who's asking, or saying thank you for a wonderful talk, but visioning and transition strategies assume some sort of community consensus. How do you incorporate deep disagreements about what it means to live a good life and how it can be achieved?
Yeah, do you know, it is difficult because you will get massively divergent views, and I do when I run these think spaces, you know. Actually, by and large, people participate in these things in a meaningful rather than an aggressive fashion. One of the ways I manage it, by the way, is I do not hold public meetings. In fact, I don't believe in public meetings. I think they're counterproductive and they bring out the worst in people. And also it gives a voice to those who are most confident in actually speaking at public meetings. So I don't hold, you know, mass public meetings of the traditional nature. I hold smaller group gatherings, and I'd rather hold more of those than fewer large gatherings. The other reason I tend to value co-production and direct engagement with local people, rather than necessarily engagement with the usual suspects, is that if you keep talking to the same people, you will keep being told the same thing. And that reinforces a conception of the world that has held court, I think, for well, I would argue this, wouldn't I, for too long. So it's good, and actually it's healthy in democracy to have divergent views. If as long as you can find a format within which you can reach a consensus. The beauty, it seems to me, of doing small area studies is it's significantly easier to achieve that. Because when they actually discuss their issues and their opportunities, so many people who are tied to a particular place realize that actually they want the same thing.
That's very interesting. But there are interesting problems here about what I might call just transitions. So for example, and how those should be done. So for example, Llandovery, you know, there are going to be a large number of people there who are going to be very car dependent in a large rural area. Now they are going to have trouble bringing their lives rapidly into some kind of alignment with any kind of headline figure that the Welsh government has given for carbon reduction. And this, of course, blew up in Macron's face completely with the Gilets jaunes. So, I mean, how do you think about those just transition problems? Excuse me.
Yeah, and you're right. You know, an area in the centre of Cardiff will have fewer problems in making a transition to sustainable transport than rural areas like Llandovery. Llandovery does have a railway, as I say. There's opportunities to invest in that to create more frequent services. But also, I guess, at the core of this is the point that actually we should be doing more, and we should have more economic activity locally, which reduces, it doesn't remove it, and it'll never remove it. And I don't think it should ever remove the necessity and the desire to travel. And I would argue there are sustainable ways of doing that as well, which don't involve flying. I haven't flown for 15 years, maybe more, and I won't. It doesn't negate those needs, those desires, and those useful, healthy bits of traveling and engaging with parts of the economy from further than your local community. But if we are rebalancing, then we are bringing many of the things that we would otherwise need to travel to, whether they're public services, retail, or whatever, closer to our doorstep. But also, we, particularly in some areas, need to invest in things. One of the things I've suggested we should do in the Llandovery study was invest in a car share scheme based on, you know, electric cars. You know, and there are models elsewhere in Wales where they have been doing that, and elsewhere. So, yes, in order to have a just transition, some places will need investment in different things to ensure it is just.
That makes good sense. There's a question from Alex Brown, and he's saying, you mentioned how local and national authorities sometimes shape their policies to accommodate big commercial players, understandably, but how do you guard against large players gaming new policy directions and distorting small local economies or their neighbours?
One of the ways you do it is make sure you've got a healthy democracy, which is both open and accountable. Very often discussions are held behind closed doors. It took a series of freedom of information requests to ensure that the information the support the Welsh government gave to Aston Martin to become public. That should never have happened. It certainly shouldn't have happened with the Wellbeing Future Generations Act. Never. You can't hide behind the cloak of commercial confidence and all the rest of it. You really can't. This is a democracy. Let's have these things out there. Let people be the judge of it. So yeah, there is a fear that, very large, powerful kind of global capital, will come along and say, we're going to solve all your problems. You need to give us a load of money or build this infrastructure or ensure that we've got a skills base. This isn't about saying, no, you can't come, but this is about limiting what we decide to do as a nation or as a region or as a country to actually support that.
Yes, it's also about informing people about what's actually involved, because a lot of these high innovation jobs with big investments that go into all sorts of areas across the entire United Kingdom, even if they work well, they are going to make a change in quantum between 2% and 5% of jobs that are needed, probably not more than that. Yeah. So there is no big, there is no big massive industrial scale coming back, because that's not in the nature of the economy, and a lot of people don't realize that. Exactly. So we're running out of time. We've got two final questions, so Matt will do the last one, but just before that, Sawaj Jaisi wants to come back, and he's asking, is there an optimum size defined by area or population, or indeed even economic activity, that can work as a deep place or a sustainable place? How big or small an area would you consider viable?
Yeah, interesting one. This we've grappled with this over the years, and we most grappled with the first study in Tredegar. In my naivety, and bear in mind, Tredegar was very much us trying to get a handle on what it is we were doing. We were almost making the research up as we went along. The methodologies were developed as we went along. So it was an iterative process, and to some extent, it was a co-productive process too. So in Tredegar, we concentrated initially on, it was my fault, it wasn't Dave's fault, because I was doing the data. We concentrated on 4 LSOA, Tredegar Central and West, which we thought, in our naivety, not being from Tredegar, although at the time I was living in Ebervale, literally just a couple of miles away, was what people thought of as Tredegar. And it was only during discussions with local people that they say, well, hang on, why haven't you included Sahawi and Georgetown, which basically are kind of almost semi-detached bits of Tredegar? And we looked at this and I thought, well, actually, if local people are telling us these are the parameters of our local community, this is what we see as our community, then we should be including these areas within these studies. The consequence was that we added an additional 6 LSOA to the study, and slightly more than doubled the population scale. And so it's an iterative process that's dependent upon what local people tell us. To sometimes it's pretty obvious. Llandovery was pretty obvious. There's a core of Llandovery, and actually, by and large, apart from some tiny hamlets, it's surrounded by a very large area of farmland or public estate. There's very few other big settlements for quite some distance, so it was pretty logical there. The Pontypool study, I took a decision on that one to exclude a neighbouring town, which some people suggested was part of Pontypool and some people wasn't. It was the community of New Inn. New Inn's a very different place from Pontypool. It's much more affluent than Pontypool, and I felt that it would potentially skew the results. So although it wasn't included in the data collection, it clearly was there, and it was a contextual kind of consideration. But to summarise, the nature of a community is determined by that community itself, by and large, and that influences the way that we do these studies.
Yes, and how you decide what the appropriate size is.
Yeah.
Although there will presumably be some economic considerations, but we've got just time for the last question from Matt, because I know he's excited and wants to ask another question. Matt, come back in, please.
Thank you. I didn't want to hog things at all. Mark, I've got a question which is about this tension perhaps between the local and the national. And it comes from, so several weeks ago, we had Danny Kruger, the MP, come and present sort of his more recent policy work on sort of localizing economies in the UK. And there was much of what he said that I thought was very interesting and aligns to some extent with the Deep Place work. But there was also, and this may be some of my bias having grown up in South Wales of anything presented perhaps by a Conservative politician. But there was, I had a certain concern here of the way in which that material was presented, which almost sort of says, let's just give local authorities a big budget and they can decide what to do with it across almost all services, which to me felt a little bit like this, almost a cutting adrift and the erosion of the sense of any kind of national project or sense of belonging within national things and services, etc. And I don't think that was necessarily his way of actually presenting that. And I'm not sure that's quite what he intended. And he gave quite a nice reply to that. But there is that perhaps tension with the Deep Place study stuff as well, right? How do we negotiate the locally determined, but also the sense of being part of something bigger, which I think we all also need as well? I was just wondering what your thoughts were on that.
Yeah, do you know, I agree. I grappled with this over the years, you know, because on the one hand, I believe in this kind of local autonomy, you know, places making their own plans, you know, determining their own futures. But on the other hand, I also believe in certain liberal democratic ecological perspectives, which I think should clearly be shared by communities, but also should be part of a bigger thing. And whether that's, you know, Wales, the UK, formerly the European Union, but also, of course, globally with the SDG goals, you know, these are things that I believe passionately should influence the way that communities live. Intrinsically, I would suggest that many of them lend themselves to more localized economic activity. I think I'm in a position where localized economies are inherently more sustainable in their multiple senses than globalized economies. So by being local, we're effectively sharing a kind of an SDG style kind of perspective, and whether or not that's, you know, a regional, national, or global priority, you know, it can be all of those things, of course. So yeah, we are part of a greater thing. We should always be part of a greater thing, though, as you, I think, suggest, that there are tensions between, you know, this idea that small is also beautiful. But hey, there are tensions and there are contradictions in all sorts of areas of research. Why should this one be any different? You know, it adds to the richness, you know, and it keeps us on our toes. It's not an answer. I'm afraid I don't have an answer. You know, it's I wish I did, because I've scratched my head over the years about it. You know, I'm also, by the way, not someone who has a great sway in the ideology of nationalism, which you might be surprised at, considering my emphasis and research around place, because I don't like the concept of the other. And it seems to me that nationalism is always determined on someone else existing who isn't part of us. I think we need inclusive localism, and that's one of the other things that I think all localities should share.
Great, that's a great answer and a great place to stop. And I'm so sorry, but as usual, we're always out of time and have many more questions and excitements to go through. But Mark, thank you very much. We've had a really lovely time talking to you today, and we are very, very grateful to you for coming and telling us about this work, which is fabulous. It really is.
That's really
work.
thank you to all of you, but also to everyone who's taken part as well, and all the questions. I'm really appreciated.
And because we are rather old-fashioned in the IGP, the panelists can unmute, and so we're going to give you a round of applause. So
Oh, bless you. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, and thanks very much for coming. We hope we'll be in touch soon. So thanks a lot. Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.
Everyone.